Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar. This is Learnings from 2025 Sustainability Data, Insights from a Year of Uncertainty and How to Plan for 2026. I'm Olivia Thompson at SEDEX, and I'll be your moderator today. So we'll do a short introduction before I introduce our speakers. This has been a really turbulent year for businesses and their supply chains. We've had regulatory uncertainty, market challenges, regional disruptions, and continued geopolitical tension. In this session, we'll explore what supply chain data from 2025 can teach us and how it can guide your plans for next year as you build resilience and agility in response to this operating environment. So we have a great agenda lined up for today. Our speakers will share insights on the key trends shaping sustainable practices and sourcing over the past year. We'll look at findings from recent site-level SMETA audits and Verdantix's global sustainability market analysis, highlighting where progress has been made and where challenges persist. We'll also talk about how leading firms are planning to allocate their resources next year to strengthen sustainability planning, compliance, and stakeholder engagement. We'll then finish with a Q&A, so please do submit any questions you have for our speakers using the Q&A chat function. I can confirm that the recording and the slides from this webinar will be shared afterwards for you to refer back to and share with colleagues. So for those of you who are new to SEDEX or SMETA, here's a quick overview of who we are. SEDEX is a solutions provider. We aim to empower more socially and environmentally sustainable supply chains across the world. Our SEDEX platform connects businesses across a supply chain for managing risks in multiple industries and regions, while also reducing duplication and effort in data sharing and other due diligence activities. Our assessment tools, from risk analysis to the in-person SMETA audit, help businesses to identify concerns, address them, and evidence improvement. SMETA is the world's most widely used social audit. It assesses a supply chain worksite across labour, health and safety, environment, and business ethics. We are absolutely delighted that this year, SMETA 7, which is the latest version of our methodology, became officially recognised by the Consumer Goods Forum's Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative. This is an independent benchmark that provides external validation of SMETA's rigour, quality, and comprehensiveness. Some of our other achievements this year include completing a significant overhaul of the SEDEX platform with increased usability, data security, more languages and features. We've also developed an adapted version of SMETA for service provider suppliers with distributed workforces. And we've launched a new sustainability intelligence and policy team, some of whom join us today. SEDEX and SMETA have been around for more than 20 years. This means we're in a unique position to provide insights on what's really happening in supply chains. Our platform contains data from more than 115,000 work sites and more than 500,000 audits from different supply chain tiers, different regions, and different activities. The insights that we're drawing from that help you decide where to focus your due diligence efforts. So now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Joining us today, we have Isis Blia, who is a senior sustainability strategist at SEDEX. Isis specialises in making complex sustainability issues clear and actionable for business teams. She analyses aggregated data from across SEDEX's global network and tools to uncover the patterns and risks shaping corporate strategies. Martine Hornseth is a sustainability intelligence strategist at SEDEX, where she draws insights to identify and analyse emerging trends in supply chain risk. Using SEDEX's vast data sets, Martine translates sustainability data into intelligence to support strategic decision-making. We're also joined by Elisa Malero, who is a senior analyst at Verdantix. Elisa is part of the ESG and sustainability practice at Verdantix. Her current research agenda focuses on supply chain sustainability, where she's led vendor benchmarking and customer intelligence reports. Elisa also advises corporate buyers, tech vendors, and service providers on digital and go-to-market strategies. So I'd like to hand over now to Elisa. Let's get started.
Thank you, Lydia, and thanks also to the SELEX team for having me today. It's always a pleasure to join one of these webinars. So just to get things started, I wanted to present what is kind of the main piece of research that we do in Verdantix, and it's the Verdantix ESG and Sustainability Global Corporate Survey 2025. So as part of this survey, we interview more than 400 executives that represent firms with at least 250 million in revenues. As part of this survey, we target senior executives within dedicated sustainability functions, holding VP, SVP, and global head of function roles. We also include corporates at firms headquartered in 33 countries, represented the 6 geographical regions that you can see in the screen. And we also target executives from companies across 15 industries, including, for example, manufacturing, agriculture, and oil and gas. And as part of this survey, we ask the following question: what is your level of ambition of your firm's sustainability strategy? And you can see in the screen that firms invest in sustainability for a variety of reasons, with the majority of firms seeking some kind of sustainability leadership. And if we go a bit deeper into the reasons behind this perception of sustainability, you can see that there is quite a lot of understand sustainability as a way to manage reputational risk, but also to deal with stakeholder pressure, for example. But more and more, we're seeing more corporations including sustainability as part of that business-related decisions. So to inform, for example, their management and decision making, but also to access capital and assurance tied to a sustainable finance. So what this data told us, and the reason I wanted to provide with this very interesting piece of information, is that in 2025, despite the pushback that we heard, especially sustainability regulations, or in some regions, for example, US, organizations are still recognizing, are investing in the strategic value of sustainability. And here you can see more data that support this statement. You can see that firms prioritize setting and meeting sustainability goals, and they want to transform this business to be more resilient. And part of this view sustainability as a resilience and a strategic factor is due to the rising number of regulations, especially in the European Union. And here you can see you can see that more than 45% of firms considers both the CSRD and the IFRS as kind of the key drivers to spend on ESG and sustainability. So again, despite the push that we hear, especially in the context of the omnibus proposal in the European Union, the relevant sustainability regulation is still there, and more companies recognize the strategic value of improving sustainability and having that conversation as well across the supply chain. However, is it true that in this context where we've seen more uncertainty and more volatility in terms of regulatory requirements, we've seen a higher relevance of voluntary reporting as a way to demonstrate what we call a genuine sustainability commitment. So no matter regulatory outcomes, a lot of these companies do want to demonstrate their sustainability performance and long-term commitment. So we can expect this trend to continue. And here you can see that 48% of firms recognize the significance of voluntary reporting with regard to increasing the spend on ESG and sustainability over the next 2 years. So another key attitude that we've seen as part of this research and in general in conversations with corporates and software vendors has been a stronger focus or interest from the corporate side on supply chains from a strategic point of view in terms of dealing with more supply chain disruptions caused by geopolitical matters, but also due to more adverse climate effects. We've seen more interest and more investment into improving the visibility and the performance across the supply chain. And what has been very interesting to see this year is that you can see that 73% of firms are already integrating ESG sustainability criteria into that procurement process. So more firms are sitting down and dealing with different internal stakeholders to figure out the best way to translate sustainability commitments into what is daily decision-making process. And here you can see as well that 59% of firms invest in supply chain sustainability solutions to increase the transparency and traceability in supply chain. So I think these two main data points are quite interesting and tells a very compelling story about how companies can invest in sustainability as a way to not only improve sustainable performance and to meet all these different compliance requirements, but also as a way to improve the resilience of their supply chain operations. However, I think it will be very easy. It's quite familiar for everyone in this call that this is far from being an easy task. And in general, firms can struggle to measure that short-term return on ESG initiatives. So in some companies and specific industries, it will still see a bit of weak internal buy-in for some sustainability initiatives itself. Also, the majority of firms that face poor visibility of suppliers beyond top tiers, and they might struggle to validate sustainability information. And this is also important because supply chain management is still a heavily manual process, which can also delay that validation of ESG roadmaps. And the fourth challenge that we see in general, not only about supply sustainability itself, but in general around sustainability, is the challenge around supplier fatigue and that disconnected engagement. So something that we always have to have in mind when talking about sustainability performance across the supply chain is that a firm ESG strategy might not match suppliers' resources or prioritization of ESG goals. And also you can see another very interesting data point from the Global Corporate Survey that you can see that this is one of the main challenges faced by organizations. You can see that 32% of firms consider external collaboration with suppliers and customers as the top challenge. And it's also closely followed by that lack of internal collaboration across business functions, including data collection and communication. So in general, we'll see the relevance of getting access to the right data management system in place and the right expertise that can provide you with very on-the-ground assessment and very realistic data to inform that sustainability commitment, and not only to focus on the compliance side of things, but to move sustainability into what is more a strategic value creation process. So on that point, I hand it back to the SEDEX team, which will present key insights for SAQs. Over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Elisa. Sorry, I'll just move this on to the next slide. So as Elisa mentioned, one of the key issues that we're facing is that kind of complexity around ESG data gathering, with supply chain management still being a heavily manual process for a lot of companies. So this can then reduce the visibility you're able to have of your suppliers and also the speed at which you're able to act on those issues that are uncovered. It can also limit the ability of companies to really be on top of the monitoring and evaluation of their supply chain due diligence, which can then make it more difficult to monitor that continuous improvement that we're aiming for over time. So I guess just to step back for a second in terms of where ICIS and I come from is, I guess as a whole, SEDEX sits on a huge amount of data, whether that's inherent risk data, SAQ data, audit data. And obviously this is hugely valuable for our members who are able to gain visibility into their own supply chain and make those improvements over time, which is obviously at the heart of what SEDEX does. But there's also a huge amount of value to be gained from anonymizing all of that data that we have across all of our members globally and analyzing the trends that we're seeing. And also more and more we're seeing that companies are wanting to understand what's happening in the kind of beyond their own supply chain so that they can have better visibility of how they're performing against their peers, and also what kind of common trends are in the countries and sectors that they're sourcing from. And then with this visibility, companies are then better able to understand their supply chain and pinpoint risks, and also then work proactively to address them and even turn them into opportunities to create kind of more resilient supply chain. So what I'm going to do before ICIS goes into a bit more of the detail of what the data is really showing is look at kind of at a higher level, what kind of trends are we seeing across SAQs and audits when it comes to things like completion rates, closure rates, and some of those nuances between countries and sectors as well. So in terms of, I guess for those of you who aren't as familiar, a large part of how SEDEX helps companies assess the risk of their suppliers is through self-assessment questionnaires or audits. And And this really then means that you're able to get better visibility of the potential risks in your supply chain through those self-assessment questionnaires before you're getting the boots on the ground through audits. It's really useful, especially to understand what kind of management systems your suppliers have in place to manage risk in their own organization supply chain. And so over the past 5 years, we've really seen an upwards trend in the completion of SAQs globally. So that's the percentage of sites that have completed the SAQ. So in 2020, that completion rate hovered around 60%, going as low as 50% in some cases. But in that past year, we've seen that completion rate reaching almost 90% on average globally as well. The highest completion rates are actually across South America and Asia, with some of the lowest completion rates across Europe, which might kind of be inverse to what some people think. And we've also, like you'll see on the right-hand side, we've seen a fall in the number of days on average that sites are taking to complete the self-assessment questionnaires. Even in just the last year, we've seen quite a significant change. So the number of sites that are taking less than a day to complete the self-assessment questionnaire has increased from 50 to 60%, and then the number of sites taking more than 15 days has then decreased from 25 to 14%. And this is showing a really positive trend in not only the speed at which suppliers are completing their SAQs, but also that coverage of data that we're getting from suppliers on that left-hand side graph. So for those sites that are identified as high risk, based on that inherent, based on both inherent risk, but also those SAQ results, many then go on to complete audits. A lot of companies taking that risk-based approach, so the high risk suppliers are the ones that will go on to do audits. And over the past 5 years, we've seen an upwards trend in the number of audits taking place. So you'll see on the left-hand side that number has doubled since 2020, which is huge progress. And the largest increase has actually been in North America, with a 139% increase since 2020. And that's then followed by Asia, which is 109% increase. There has been you'll see there's a slight dip in audits this year, but only by about 2.5%. This audit data is also from the beginning of December, so there's still that month to go. And this is also then the case across most audits, but across most continents. But what we are seeing is an increase in, despite all the other continents decreasing slightly at the end of this year, North America, we've still seen that increase by about 8% since 2024, even at this point in December. So if it just moves on to the next slide. Here you'll then see, we can go into a bit more detail on the percentage change in the number of audits between 2024 and 2025. You'll see in the middle there, you've got manufacturing, financial services, agriculture. So these are really, especially manufacturing and agriculture, are really the heartland of SEDEX. So they make up a large proportion of our sites. And the number of sites audited from last year to this year has stayed relatively similar. But what we are seeing an increase in is more around those service providers and support activities. So things like real estate, professional services, education, which are obviously more service-based, but then you've also got those kind of support services like construction and transport and storage as well. And transportation and storage actually makes it the third highest sector across SEDEX after agriculture and manufacturing as well. So I guess this is really just a sign to show that whilst the physical product supply chain, like whether that's fast-moving consumer goods or retail, whilst they're remaining pretty constant, we're seeing companies putting more emphasis on auditing those kind of more service-based suppliers, which is a great sign, and also might have be correlated as well to things like the service provider SAQ and service provider audit that SEDEX released this last year as well. We can then also go on to look at what the average number of days it takes sites to close non-compliances is. So over this last year, the average has been around 57 days globally, and that's been quite a significant decrease since 2024, which is really positive. So last year it was a 76-day average. We can also then break that further down by the countries that are taking the longest or shortest amount of time. But you'll see the tables here showing the countries and sectors that are taking the longest amount of time to close non-compliances. So for example, on the left, you'll see France, Netherlands, and Sweden, which again might surprise you, but there might be, there's a lot of reasons why this could be. So for example, these are often countries with more stringent regulations and permitting requirements, which means that it can take longer to close out those non-compliances. And that might, for example, you also have stronger collective bargaining agreements or union-related non-compliances. And then on the right-hand side, if you look at the sectors with the highest number of days to close those non-compliances, and you've got things like administrative and support service activities, which could have similar issues to what we see across France, Netherlands, and Sweden around those kind of regulations and permitting requirements. But you've also got the agricultural and transportation sectors taking a high number of days to close non-compliances as well. So there really is a lot of variety, but it's really interesting then to break it down so that we can not just look at the risk, but see kind of the opportunity and where can we focus our efforts to support our suppliers in reducing non-compliances, but also helping them close those non-compliances quicker as well. Just briefly, I guess, from last year as well. So some of you might be aware, but some of you might not, that this time last year, or maybe around September last year, we released SMETA 7.0, which is the most recent audit methodology of Sedex. And so what we've done is compare what are the detection rates of non-compliances from our old audit methodology to this new audit methodology. So the biggest change that we've seen by percentage has been in environmental non-compliances, and that's then been followed by discrimination and forced labour. Some of the reasons around these big increases that we're seeing can be around more specific guidance on what non-compliances looks like and being designed to really ensure that auditors know exactly what they're looking for. There's also increased emphasis on non-compliances linked to management systems. And that's really around the fact that management systems are that bedrock of how companies manage their risk in their own organizations, but also in their supply chain. And non-compliances around management systems can also then be seen as early warning signs for findings of more severe issues down the line. So things like forced labor and child labor. And what's really important is that even though there might be some areas where findings are less common, and that goes for all audits globally, but they might also be the issues that are harder to detect. So for example, the issues like child and forced labor, even if the incidence of findings might seem low, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're lower risk or not present. So if we go on to, just before I hand over to Isis, I guess through all of this data that we're able to get visibility across, we're then better able to understand where those high risk and most common issues are. And what we see come out as the three most common issues globally, and that's across most sectors, most countries, is around health and safety, wages, and working hours. So this is taking the results from audits in the last 12 months and looking at the percentage of audits with non-compliances linked to these three areas, which you'll then see broken down by region. And you'll see that Asia largely comes out on top across all of these three industries, with over half of audits having a wage and working hour non-compliance and over 90% of health and safety non-compliances. And obviously this picture does give us a better picture of risk, which can kind of inherently be seen as a negative, but what it does really gives us an opportunity to then do is better to understand those issues that we're seeing. And like I've already mentioned, really work closely with those groups of suppliers to address the most common and most severe non-compliances. If we then compare the most common issues, health and safety is undoubtedly the most common non-compliance globally. On average, health and safety issues have been identified in at least 3 out of 4 audits conducted across every region, and that's on average. And I won't go into detail on every bar that we're seeing on this graph, but what is interesting is that North America, which does have a lower incidence of non-compliances around health and safety and wages, comes out as the second highest when it comes to working hours. And again, there could be several reasons for this. So it could be around kind of the weaker statutory limits on working hours, a very productivity-driven work culture, low minimum wages, weak collective bargaining agreements. I mean, we could keep going and dig into every bar, but we'll have to save that for another webinar. And then if we just finally look at then, I guess what we're seeing a lot of is companies thinking that the risk is further afield, it's abroad, that the risk closer to home is lower, that it's less severe. But what we're really seeing is that that's not always the case. So what we see is that 33% of sites audited in the last 12 months globally are seen as high risk when it comes to the kind of scoring of SEDEX. And 23% of these high risk sites are located in Europe and North America, which are often in regions seen as low risk. And as we've seen already, health and safety, working hours and wages rank in those top three. Well, the graph on the screen is showing the top 4 critical and non-critical, critical and business critical non-compliances across the US or North America and Europe. So those 3 remain the same, so around the health and safety, working hours and wages. But we're also then seeing responsible recruitment as one of the key drivers of these critical non-compliances. And when we think about responsible recruitment risks, Europe and North America are often, again, labeled as lower risk with kind of strong labor laws or mature institutions, and also being high income countries create kind of a sense of security. But social risks don't just disappear because regulations exist. We've still got migrant workers, temporary staff, gig workers, often hired through subcontractors who face excessive fees or discrimination or unsafe working conditions. And because these risks are then assumed to be minimal, companies might be conducting fewer audits or applying lighter due diligence or relying on third-party recruiters, which can then really create those blind spots. So I'll wrap up there and hand over to Isis, but yeah, I guess the key message is really that recognizing these hidden risks is really key. So over to you, Isis.
Amazing. Thank you, Martine. I guess just on that point about impacts taking place within Europe and the US, we're also seeing that reflected in the courts. There's been a consistent rise in litigation cases against companies that haven't effectively managed supply chain risks. And importantly, many of these cases relate to impacts happening within Western jurisdictions, not just emerging markets. For example, this year we've seen proceedings in both the US and Europe testing whether companies can genuinely demonstrate oversight of their sourcing practices. We've also noticed that this is sector agnostic. We're seeing actions across food and drink, fashion, luxury, technology, and minerals. And of course, the examples on this slide are very much just a small subset of a wider pattern of scrutiny. What's interesting is how this rise in litigation is happening alongside stronger trade enforcement mechanisms like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act or the UFLPA. Whilst the two systems operate separately, they're actually driving the same kind of accountability dynamic. So court cases are sharpening expectations for credible oversight, whilst the UFLPA, for example, is giving those expectations real-world consequences at the border. We know that $1 billion worth of goods were blocked at the US border this year. So I guess together they're creating a consistent message that companies must be able to trace, verify, and stand behind the integrity of their supply chains. And really due diligence is now becoming that kind of foundation of credible, defensible, sustainable practice, and also legal resilience. And I guess that brings us on to the next piece, which is traceability, because you can't demonstrate a credible due diligence if you don't know who's in your supply chain. Over the past year, it's been one of the most active areas of debate, especially around the CSDDD revisions under Omnibus, where there's been a lot of discussion about whether companies should take a tier 1 approach or a risk-based one, with the understanding that risk typically consolidates much further down the supply chain. I think it's becoming increasingly clear from both a policy and practice view that risk-based due diligence is the direction of travel. And that's really exactly what we're seeing in SEDEX's dataset. So in the past 12 months, 75% of companies created at least one indirect supplier link, showing that firms are actively trying to see beyond their tier 1. And for reference, an indirect link on SEDEX simply means a supplier beyond tier 1, so someone who's connected to a buyer's supply chain through another supplier rather than directly. Amongst companies with more than 100 supplier connections, 36% of those links are indirect, which really shows that deeper traceability is becoming part of that kind of business as usual, not just a one-off exercise. But it's also not just about mapping connections or making those links. Companies are also taking actions. So when we look across all companies on our platform that conducted more than 100 audits in the past 12 months, we found that on average, around 30% of those audits were carried out on indirect suppliers. So this shows that despite these policy negotiations that have been happening this year, due diligence and verification are starting to extend beyond tier 1, reaching into parts of the supply chain where the real risks often lie. But of course, deeper traceability only works if the suppliers that you're partnering with have the structures and resources to respond to those expectations. And I guess our data is showing that there's still a little bit of a maturity curve. So if companies were relying purely on that kind of supplier cascading model, which was initially proposed under Omnibus, that approach may not be able to capture the full picture yet. And that's because if we look at the SEDEX data from the past year on SAQs, 36% of suppliers haven't yet adopted a human rights due diligence approach in line with the UNGPs. That means that many are still in the process of formalizing their due diligence systems, which is very understandable given the pace of regulatory change. At the same time, there are also some encouraging signs. So around 63% of suppliers say a senior manager or a business owner is responsible for due diligence, showing that leadership and ownership are really increasingly reaching that kind of leadership level. And 22% have a qualified human rights manager in place, which suggests a growing professionalization of human rights roles across the supplier base. So I suppose what this is telling us is that suppliers were engaging and evolving this year, but buyers will still need to continue providing support and alignment as expectations rise across the chain. And this capability gap becomes slightly more clear when we look at specific risk areas. So even for the most fundamental human rights issues, management systems across supplier networks remain incomplete. SEDEX's SAQ data shows that 19% of companies didn't have a detailed modern slavery policy that was communicated to all workers, and 27% lack a policy on child labor or young workers. And in fact, that policy on child labor is a policy requirement under the SMETA audit as well. So the picture of this year is one of maybe gradual improvement, but not universal coverage. And while regulatory pressure is being applied at the top, the real challenge lies in ensuring that every tier has the systems, the policies, and the oversight needed to really manage those core human rights risks effectively. So we've talked about how companies have been building systems and capability for due diligence. But when it comes to the most serious risks like modern slavery, companies, of course, need tools that go beyond a supplier having a policy in place. Forced labor risks can be incredibly difficult to detect, even through audits, because they don't appear as a single obvious issue. Instead, they're embedded in everyday practices, in patterns that might seem routine, but actually create dependency and limit workers' freedom to leave or even refuse work. To help companies identify these kinds of underlying risks, we actually launched a forced labor indicators report this year. And that uses audit data to highlight where forced labor risks may be present, even if forced labor itself wasn't directly identified as a non-compliance. And this report draws on the ILO's recognized indicators of forced labor. So over the past 12 months, the most common indicators we've seen are excessive overtime, abusive living and working conditions, management system failures, and the withholding of wages. And these really signal kind of power imbalances or coercive practices that make workers vulnerable to exploitation. And of course, these findings don't confirm that forced labor is taking place, but they really provide that kind of early warning system that helps companies pinpoint where vulnerabilities may exist and take action before harm occurs. So we've spoken about human rights related risk, but this year we also heard a lot from companies that silos within their sustainability teams are becoming a real barrier to making progress. In many businesses, human rights and environmental teams are really working separately, even though the issues on the ground might be deeply connected. So to explore that link at a supplier level, we looked at the overlap between environmental and social non-compliances in the SEDEX audit data from the past year, just really to be able to see whether weakness in one area may tend to appear in another. I just want to caveat that we know that correlation does not mean causation, but I suppose this kind of analysis can show companies, how to triangulate their own findings to identify patterns and early warning signs across multiple code areas. So what we found is quite striking. Over half of sites with hazardous waste non-compliances, which is an environmental non-compliance, also failed to maintain adequate accident prevention systems, which is a social non-compliance under health and safety. And that could suggest that poor control of dangerous materials may go hand in hand with broader safety management weaknesses. We also found that around a quarter of sites missing an environmental policy also lacked a human rights policy, and that might indicate that these gaps are, systemic rather than issue specific. And 1 in 5 sites without systems to manage environmental impacts also breached overtime limit, which may point to shared operational pressures. So for instance, production demands limiting investment in both environmental management and labor conditions. What this tells us is that the same underlying business pressures can create risks across multiple sustainability areas at once. So if buyers continue to manage human rights and environmental performance in separate work streams, they might risk missing those shared root causes, tackling symptoms in isolation rather than addressing really what drives them. So you could say that companies tackling sustainability in silos are hitting diminishing returns. So that was a little bit about this past year, but we also wanted to look ahead to 2026 as well. So a couple, definitely not predictions, but some kind of assumptions about what we might see next year. We expect to see a focus shift from kind of building processes to instead really proving results. Over the past few years, companies have invested really heavily in systems and frameworks and kind of getting everything in place for reporting. But our assumption is that the next phase is really going to be about evidencing positive outcomes. So showing that these systems are delivering measurable improvements and not just compliance. We're really in a period of kind of green hushing and heightened scrutiny on the value of sustainability in the corporate setting. So our expectation is that sustainability teams are going to be focusing on demonstrating value through results, linking performance to business resilience, to risk mitigation, long-term value creation, rather than kind of big sort of long-term commitments. We also expect to see a deeper convergence between climate and social issues. One of the key outcomes of COP30 was this agreement to create a new global mechanism for a just transition, recognizing that climate action and human rights must move forward together. So in short, I guess we expect that companies will increasingly be expected to show that their environmental gains aren't coming at a social cost. We also, of course, can't talk about the future without mentioning AI. We anticipate that AI is going to play a much larger role in due diligence. On one hand, it might perform as a key enabler, so helping companies predict and prevent risk through real-time data analysis and pattern recognition. On Sedex's side, we're also really proud that we are involved in the Global Data Partnership Against Forced Labor, and that's in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. And that's going to be using AI to facilitate data sharing and access to forced labor data. But on the flip side, we also expect there to be kind of growing scrutiny around how AI itself affects people, from biases in algorithms to surveillance concerns. And I guess the EU's AI Act is going to be really central here, helping to set guardrails, really to ensure that AI kind of enhances rather than undermines human rights and due diligence integrity. We also expect that supplier capability building is also going to move up on the agenda. Under the CSDDD, companies are expected to show how they support suppliers in meeting standards, rather than just kind of impose them through contracts. So we're expecting to see more of a kind of shared ownership model, co-funded improvement plans, and supplier partnerships that can focus on lasting capability. And finally, we also expect that forced labor is going to remain a defining priority. The evidence suggests that these risks have really deepened and not diminished over time. So we expect companies to focus on recruitment fees, as Martine was talking about, migrant and refugee workers, and maybe some other kind of hidden points of forced labor vulnerability that can sit far beyond Tier 1. Great. I'm going to hand it back to Elisa to share Verdantix's findings for the coming year.
Thank you, Isis. I think one of the key insights you provided has been honestly very interesting to hear through this webinar, is the relevance of data, of the talents of data, of siloed data, right? So as kind of the underlying challenge that a lot of companies face when improving the sustainability performance or getting visibility across supply chain. So from the Verdantix side, one of the key investment or key priorities that we identify for 2026 has been an improvement in data management and reporting for ESG and sustainability. And here you can see also another data point from the Global Corporate Survey, where it shows that over 70% of firms considers data management reporting for ESG and sustainability as the number one or high priority of a spend. And what is quite interesting is that it probably has some cascading effect to other use cases. So as firms are looking into meeting that or solving the challenges around siloed data, that investment is also going to go to support other use cases. It could be, for example, energy transition, integrating ESG and sustainability factors into what is more investment decision making, but also, for example, to manage resource consumption. So in terms of investment, what we can expect in 2026, the first priority and the key challenge to solve is going to be that data management reporting for ESG and sustainability. So we will continue seeing the trend in the next 12 months. Also recognize that we've threw a lot of information during about half hours. So we also wanted to provide some kind of best practice or key actions to consider in 2026. One of the key advice that we usually give from Verdantix to corporates is the relevance of starting internally. So we've seen before that one of the key challenges is that lack of internal buy-in. And in so many cases, it is a data problem. So it is important to have the data management system in place that can provide you with relevant data to build that business case that reflect ESG and results. And also this requires matching what is. And to do that, it is key to localize and engage with your suppliers across the supply chain network. To do that, it is very important to get better visibility in your supply chain. So improving ESG risk monitoring as well as facilitating suppliers with the right resources and information. And finally, something that we always like to emphasize is that ESG and sustainability is a team sport, and it requires some level of industry collaboration especially to disseminate sustainability standards, but also to disseminate that expertise on best practices for supply chain sustainability. So that's everything from my side. I'll hand it back to Olivia for the Q&A.
Well, thank you everybody so much. We've had some really great insights today, and I know questions are coming through from our audience. So let's move into this Q&A. Firstly, one that's come through, do we see, perhaps particularly from SEDEX data, that smaller suppliers don't have specific human rights policies, for example, child labour, because they state that they're following all applicable laws and regulations that perhaps don't extend those requirements to smaller businesses? Martine, perhaps you can answer that one.
Yeah. I guess in terms of what the specifics of the data show, I'd have to dig into it a bit more. But in terms of, I guess, what we're seeing with smaller suppliers, I think a key reason why we're perhaps seeing that lack of human rights and social issues are around purely a lack of understanding and a lack of awareness around these issues. We see the same around, for example, with issues like child labour, one of the key non-compliances we're seeing is around companies not having remediation processes in place. And that's largely because companies aren't aware, first of all, that they need the process, but also that they don't necessarily know that it's an issue that they need to address. And even if they did, they wouldn't know how to address it. So it kind of can fall through the gaps in some cases. But I think in that sense, I guess it really shows the importance of then working closely with your suppliers, even the smaller ones. And obviously I know that there's capacity constraints. So it's I know that there are a lot of limits for companies in place, but I think the biggest part of it is that awareness. So I guess I know a lot of companies have or in the OECD guidance, it says like one of the requirements is to cascade your requirements down your supply chain. And I guess it's really not for no reason that that's there, because a lot of the time companies work with a lot of suppliers and smaller suppliers. So around kind of that policy piece, I think that's kind of the number one reason, at least from what I've seen. But and I'm sure the legislation piece, like companies think, oh, well, I'm compliant with legislation, but don't necessarily always know what that means when it comes to the higher risk issues and like really specific issues as well. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, and of course we know that the risk doesn't go away with smaller businesses. So those policies are still absolutely crucial for that risk management and resilience piece.
Absolutely. And then that like supplier capacity building piece comes in. And I know that, well, I was at a conference just recently with one of our auditors, and they were saying that a lot of their suppliers don't know that some of these resources exist through SEDEX. So I think that's kind of your first point of call if you have suppliers that really don't know how to engage in these policies and procedures. There's a lot of really good resources out there. So definitely encourage you to point them in that direction.
Yeah, great. And Martine, perhaps you can answer this one as well, particularly when it comes to suppliers beyond tier one, beyond direct suppliers. How can we ensure data quality and completeness from those lower tier businesses?
Yeah, I think it comes again to that kind of setting the right expectations of your suppliers, and that can be through obviously the easiest mechanism and first mechanism we often have is through that supplier code of conduct. But that doesn't necessarily give suppliers a full understanding of what might be expected of them, whether that's kind of self-assessment questionnaires or audits. But I think really setting those clear expectations, using standardized tools and templates, I think, I mean, it's part of the reason why SEDEX was founded was because of this inconsistency in how companies report on social due diligence, and really making sure that then instead of duplicating all the work and having lots of different ways of reporting these results, you have one way of doing it. So using tools like SEDEX, or of course there's other things out there, but using things that are widely used, and that might also be industry specific. I know there are some mechanisms that are really specifically tailored for industries. I think also, like I said, around supplier training, I know that has its limitations when it comes to obviously your capacity. But I think also kind of triangulating that data when it comes to inconsistencies around data, using, and again, this does take that extra bit of effort, let's say, around using self-reported data, but also audit data. We also, through these audits, have these worker interviews, and whilst you might not necessarily get all the visibility of what's discussed in those interviews because of the kind of confidentiality around it, there are ways to kind of triangulate that information to fill in any gaps. And where you might feel like you're lacking gaps, then maybe that's a sign to then engage a bit more with those suppliers.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think we've got time for just one more. So apologies to the other questions that we've received. We'll try and get back to those others. But as a last one, Elisa, perhaps you can talk about this. From your perspective and with all of the work that you've done, what are the best ways that businesses can use technology and data to connect different functions, particularly sustainability and procurement, in this context of supply chain sustainability? We know sometimes sustainability in particular can be siloed from other parts of an organization, but actually the real benefits come the more that the collaboration and kind of effective interconnection is there.
That's a great question, something I could answer in more than 1 hour, more like a couple of minutes, but I'll try my best to answer that one. I think, as I said before, something that we always have to have in mind is that ESG and sustainability in practice, it is a data problem. So a lot of this lack of internal buy-in or lack of collaboration or communication, it is due to poor visibility or poor transparency from a data management side of things, right? So in terms of how data and technology can help building up that collaboration internally, first in terms of building visibility, transparency across the supply chain, that is crucial for sustainability, as we said before, but also to kind of direct the right resources and time to the more tangible actions, right? So a lot of this matters. It does require a lot of time and expertise, having the data and the right technology can help you kind of decide target actions for the suppliers, but also to communicate the relevance and the impact of that matter. For it could be for the supplier, it could be for the procurement team itself, right? So as we said before, if sustainability is not only about compliance, it is actually a strategic a matter. We need that integration between sustainability and other functions. And to do that, the only way to do it is through having high quality data and also on the ground assessment that can provide a really good transparency and visibility across the supply chain.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can all agree with that. So that's all we have time for. Thank you everybody so much for joining us today, and thank you very much to our speakers especially. You can reach out to any of our speakers, particularly on LinkedIn, and of course to Sedex directly through sedex.com. Let us know what you're interested in, what your needs are. One of the team will get back to you. And we look forward to sharing more with you, particularly in 2026. Thank you very much.